Hi everyone, welcome to my paper, Wretched of the Multiverse, Everyday Racism and Other Cosmic Quandaries. This was presented as part of Comics Forum's recent symposium in Leeds of this month. So let's begin. This paper is part two of in a seven-part series that uses the Infinity Stones from the original Marvel comics and the film storylines as extended metaphors for thinking about oppression and privilege differently. I delivered part one in March 2024, so this year for Kingston University's Writing Cultures group. And it used the Ant-Man mythology and its ideas of subatomic universes and the particles that give him and the Wasp their powers as an entry point into how microaggressions may operate at a subatomic level. Gerald Sue describes microaggressions as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, and sexual orientation, and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. So tiny but powerful, and do harm should one encounter enough of them. It brought me to the term subatomic racism as a graphic description of how microaggressions move through the body, tinier than the smallest virus, effectively. This paper is based on an earlier Medium article, should anyone want to read it, and the title's pictured there, Microaggression, How Ant-Man and the Wasp Offers Longed-for Alt Terminology. And that led to my lecture, Honey, I Shrunk Racism, which was the one I did for Kingston's Writing Cultures group. And then later on, a conference paper in York titled Microaggressions Disassembled, which I'll link in the description. And I'll link in the description and also in this video here on the top of the screen. But this paper is part two. I think about time, racial microaggressions and its effects, not only through Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and other scholars, but really using Marvel films and TV shows as part of what Jack Halberstam called a silly archive to make complex topics a bit more approachable, which might also be good for children. Halberstam uses silly archive to taking inspiration from Lauren Ballant's term silly object to describe counter knowledges to the mainstream, notably in relation to gender, sexuality, and queerness. He uses animation as part of his silly archive. My paper uses Marvel films and TV shows as part of my silly project. In that sense. In 1961, the English version of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth published in the UK, because it was originally came out in French. Because Fanon, who was French Martinican, wrote it amidst Algeria's independent struggle from France and saw how colonial war, as he called it, led to mental illness in many Algerian insurgents. Writing from the 1950s and the very, very early 60s, he says, in this period of colonization, when it is not contested by armed resistance, when the sum total of harmful stimuli overstep a certain threshold, the defensive attitude of the natives gives way and they find themselves crowding the mental hospitals. There was thus, during this calm period, a regular and important mental pathology, which is the direct product of oppression. Today, the war of national liberation, which has been carried on by the Algerian people for the last 7 years, has become a favourable breeding ground for mental disorders. Because so as far as the Algerians are concerned, it is a total war. Similarly, and obviously it's the 60s as well, so some of the language here is quite dated. So, similarly, the impact of histories of enslavement, or process of enslavement, public lynching, and segregation on America's black population may be contextualized in a likewise way. Just as much in the UK context of white terror campaigns, including the 1919 so-called race riots, as they were reported on at the time, in Liverpool, Cardiff, and Glasgow, um, to the Second World War, where similar things happened. For example, at Bamber Bridge, just outside of Preston in Lancashire, where Black American soldiers were um, attacked by their white officers. Um, who wanted to import their own Jim Crow style racism onto British soil. Um, to even today, with the August 2024 white racist pogroms that we all saw on the news and so on. Yet these are more overt gestures, racist gestures, um, and are much easier to measure and look at, or not necessarily look at, but observe, um, than say everyday microaggressions, which are sometimes a bit more nuanced to pick out. Writing from a United States context, in his book My Grandmother's Hands, trauma psychotherapist and writer Resmaa Menakem further tells us if the persistence of white supremacy in 21st century America surprises you, this book will give you a startlingly different understanding of why. You will discover the vital force behind white supremacy is in our blood and in our nervous systems. It's the equivalent of a toxic chemical we ingest on a daily basis. Eventually, it changes our brains and the chemistry of our bodies. That alteration of brain chemistry means that many people who have been victims of from everything, from things from genocide to everyday microaggressions. In 1970, African American psychiatrist Chester Pierce first used this term microaggression to give words to an everyday anti-Blackness happening in America. The enormity of the complications they can cause, he says, can be appreciated only when we consider the subtle blows are delivered incessantly. For Black people, this could be name calling, white people touching our hair without consent, and also things like being asked where you're from repeatedly and often every day. Um, it's just the everyday indignities of being Black in a Western country built on white supremacist thinking in that sense. Now I wonder if that impacts how we might perceive time. Scientists discovered years ago that racism works at a cellular level, which I came to allegorize under subatomic racism. Now compound that over 400 years, going back to the plantation enslavement. So, thus, back to Fanon and colonial violence and mental illness. Philosophy scholar Desiree H. Melton further informs us as long as racism shows no signs of abating and doesn't, the rational mind anticipates the assault and the body's sympathetic nervous system plans for it by preparing us to fight or flee the terror we haven't been able to escape for centuries. 400 years later, Black people continue to experience as well as anticipate daily assaults on their person and dignity. British physicist Brian Cox um, describes the word time as the constant ticking that marks the passage of our lives. Marbles and infinity stones can't control essential parts of our existence in the fictional tale: space, reality, power, soul, mind, and time. So the time stone on screen first appears in the film Doctor Strange, and Stephen Strange finds it in the Eye of Agamotto in the ancient library of Kamar-Taj. He later uses it to trap Dormammu in an infinite time loop, which stops him from destroying the Earth. The Ancient One also brought the Time Stone to the Battle of New York in 2012, so the film Avengers Assemble, to New York to defend the New York Sanctum from the Chitauri. What if we thought about how the effects of relentless microaggressions impact the brain in terms of time and our ability to process it properly, or some people process it properly. People who have complex post-traumatic stress disorder may experience the past not as in the past, but by in fact, as one scholar says, creating a warped sense of timelessness, which may include those who have incurred complex racialized trauma as well. The Time Stone offers an entry point because the premise of it in the Marvel canon was the anticipation of Thanos. violence, assault, and an event-level genocide, and the trauma that comes with those events. In series two of Loki, we see Loki experience something similar, that is referred to as time slipping as well, allowing Loki to move between past, present, and future. We see a similar thing in Ms. Marvel with Pakistani American teenager Kamala Khan and her bangle known as a quantum band, and she uses it to move between 21st century America and the partition of India in 1947, not always in control. Kamala slipping between times imitates a similar process of those implicated by intergenerational trauma of colonialism. When it comes down to it, many of us will block those memories, the memories of our own personal experiences of racism and those of our ancestors as well. There's still a lot of shame, for example, in many black communities around this. This made me think about the series WandaVision, set after the collective trauma the world experienced in Avengers Endgame after half of the world were wiped from existence by Thanos. In WandaVision, um, so wiped from existence by Thanos, and then brought back as well. So, in WandaVision, Scarlet Witch and Vision live in a suburban town called Westview, completely made up by Wanda's chaos magic, which is basically, and Westview effectively is just a huge trauma response from Wanda. Their reality starts moving through times, much in the same way that for all the experiences of racism I've had, I'm brought back to my grandparents' Windrush migration experience and prior family histories of enslavement. In her book Beloved, Toni Morrison coined the term rememory. Um, she coined this term rememory as well, to describe the act of recalling repressed memories, notably in African American context of enslavement. So, thinking about Marvel films and the comics, the Time Stone may be a useful metaphor for showing the complexities of those racialized experiences. Each individual Black person, subject to their own nuanced histories of racial violence, living in their own timelines in a way that has similarities with every other Black person, but each one is still just has enough differences to set you apart from each other. Um, Toni Morrison takes us back to Fanon and him making that link between colonial violence and mental illness. So we may see how the descendants through intergenerational trauma may then process time differently. Reinhart Koselleck argued historical time as multi-layered, and so the effects of racism may be considered as a time and also reality bending process. So beginning with racism that eats away at the body's cells, so microaggressions, so things like microaggressions, I, the way microaggressions impact our body and our ability to process time, I began to think about under a different term. So the way the effects of racialized trauma send some minds to the stars, and I put that in air quotes on purpose because it's more of a metaphor than an actual thing, impacting the brain's ability to process time, I began to think about as celestial racism. Um, Physicist Michael Pravica offered a disputed theory suggesting that human consciousness may link to hidden dimensions beyond our perception. So this is like what I said about microaggressions working and moving smaller than an atom because we feel it but we can't see it. Pravica argues in moments of heightened awareness like dreaming, one's consciousness may access these higher planes. Might we access these higher planes when feeling the brunt of daily racism and other isms? With every racist encounter, our minds might be sent back in time, in a way, to what our ancestors experienced, what Toni Morrison recalled as rememory in Beloved. So at the core of his thinking is hyperdimensionality. While his theory is faced with skepticism for being too science fiction, according to some of his colleagues, as someone whose ideas were based in art originally, not science, I really like this idea, as I'm trying to use popular culture to do my academic work another way, giving graphic descriptions of experiences that are not necessarily felt in this physical reality or scene, including how racist encounters may also impact the spirit, i.e., the soul stone. So this paper aimed to describe the way the time stone may be used as a hook to attach people's thinking about racialized time and introduce non-academic audiences like children to conversations about microaggressions and wider inequalities beyond the very exclusive ways they can be talked about in academic spaces. Because I'm not looking for scientific accuracy, I can use popular culture as a fun way or a more interesting way to provoke these types of conversations. As a growth space, academia can limit how we think, as even as a PhD researcher, I've seen it's easy to see that not all forms of thinking are supported by the institution or even seen as legitimate. We see the same thing in Marvel's Doctor Strange as well, between Strange and the Ancient One, where she says, "You are a man looking at the world through a keyhole, and you spent your whole life trying to widen that keyhole to see more, to know more. And now, on hearing that it can be widened in ways you can't imagine, you reject the possibility." Everything I've said in this paper has been talked about in different ways before. For example, people like Charles Mills talked about racialized time and chronopolitics, and I'll put those links in the description too. But new knowledge can be another way to connect the dots or new ways to approach old problems. When I widen that keyhole into the silly archive of queer studies, the possibilities grew tenfold and reminds me how queer studies destabilizes what is seen as normal, which for me is also abundantly neurodivergent coded too. In my work on Marvel comics and the Infinity Stones as educational tools, I turn repeatedly to the city archives of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Or some may say, how can we use a company engineered by corporate capitalism to do this? The Marvel stories from their beginning have always been a little edgy, even if under a wider, more problematic umbrella. I find this all quite amusing, using comics to approach serious issues. In my usual realms of sociology and history, there are a lot of great thinkers who take themselves really seriously, but I'm looking for more quirky ways to think. What images can we conjure of racism's effects at a microscopic level? What do the effects of microaggressions look like beyond the naked eye? Jack Halberstam's book Wild Things reminds us how Black people's bodies and minds are seen through the white gaze as a chaotic force of nature, unregulated, unpredictable, and unrestrained as we see through constant threats of violence and policing. For me, looking at the detrimental impact of microaggressions, I'm looking at the effects of colonialism and colonial violence and its legacies on a microscopic level. I turn to the city archive of the Marvel comics and the Infinity Stones and what they can say to us. At the dawn of the universe, there was nothing, then boom. The Big Bang sent 6 elemental crystals hurtling across the virgin universe. These Infinity Stones each control an essential aspect of existence: space, reality, power, soul, mind, and time. Say Doctor Strange and one. And if that's not that could be a metaphor for how microaggressions may operate in several different ways. And if you remove one element of that, the whole thing falls to pieces. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks very much for listening. And if anyone has comments or anything like that, you can leave them in the comment section or send me an email. So tradeventour.com/contact.